Mic working? You guys can hear? Okay, good. Okay. Thanks for a great introduction for all of us, actually. I often wish that my mom could hear that, because then she'd think that I was actually doing something worthwhile. Did anyone see MSNBC this morning? I was just curious. We were talking to Darren. They actually showed the Peabody here in Memphis. Did you see it? With the ducks and everything? And they're looking for another duck person. So if anyone gets tired of the whole GAD thing, that's like a plan B, I don't know what the pay is, but I heard that it's all the duck you can eat. So it might be a good thing to think about if you like duck. Just out of curiosity, because I've been talking to some people, and foreclosure fallout obviously is an issue that impacts some of our states more than others. Stephen and I are both from Florida, so obviously we're ground zero for that. But at a show of hands, can you just raise your hand if foreclosure fallout is a big issue in your state? Okay, so about half the people. The interesting thing is I was talking to some people. Is Lori here, still from Wyoming? I was talking to Lori about foreclosure fallout in Wyoming, and at first the conversation was it's not such a big deal there, but then it led into a conversation about how tight credit is now in Wyoming because the banks are dealing with what they're dealing with in our states. So it really does affect all of us. I'm going to try to cover in a global way so that everyone can take back to the realtors in their states the parts that apply to them, but my job is sort of to just do a quick overview of all of the initiatives that have come out as a result of foreclosure fallout. When I began writing Foreclosure Fallout, of course, it was on this cross-country flight, and the part that we left out is I was sitting next to a gynecologist, and all he wanted to talk about was his cases. So the laptop was also sort of a coy, so I didn't have to talk to him anymore. But the whole point of that book was really, I had been at a mortgage servicing default conference, and everyone was saying how many subprime loans were going into default. That was back in 2006. And having been on the front line running this joint venture for First American, it didn't take a Rhodes Scholar to put the two and two together. So the book was really about why we shouldn't become a foreclosure nation and what could potentially happen if all these people went into foreclosure and what could happen if foreclosure became a part of our culture, which is kind of interesting because by a show of hands, how many people knew someone 8 or 10 years ago who had been in foreclosure? 2 people. I knew someone, they lived in Florida, but the foreclosure was in California. But now, how many people, if you don't know someone directly, have maybe a house down the street or are working on an REO, how many people have been exposed to foreclosure now? Almost everyone. So, from a psychological standpoint, obviously we know that the more people become exposed to something like that, the more it becomes indoctrinated into our society and the less the social stigma still lingers. And from a foreclosure fallout standpoint, even though we're going to be talking about legislation, from a cultural standpoint, that is the biggest piece of foreclosure fallout that this has happened. The fact that foreclosure has now become indoctrinated into our culture, and even when the deficit is paid down, and even when these reforms start working, the values that we now have about foreclosure and walking away from those obligations are going to stick with us for another generation. I had this conversation with Stephen from South Carolina. He's actually seeing people, retirees, coming down from the Northeast and walking away from their homes, cashing out the equity and buying in South Carolina and just not really caring what happens with their homes. So even when we see recovery, we may still see some phenomenons like that because foreclosure is just not as bad as it used to be. In terms of the initiatives, and can you pass that? I think I left that there. In terms of the initiatives, we're going to talk real quickly about the 3 kind of buckets. The first that we've seen are what we call the triage type initiatives, and those are the things that are designed to just stop the bleeding. So we're talking about modifications and short sales and things like that. We're going to look real briefly at the indicators to see if those initiatives are working, and then we'll talk about reform. The reform is, of course, the longer term things designed to fix the systems themselves and punish the bad guys. In terms of the triage initiatives, they've come in a couple of buckets. The first bucket is what we call foreclosure intervention, so trying to stop the foreclosure in the first place, and of course the most popular one there has been making home affordable. Can you raise your hands if you're familiar with making home affordable? Okay, so everyone kind of knows. The HAMP modification, of course, was the most popular piece of making home affordable. Did anyone know someone who tried to get a HAMP modification? Does anyone know someone who actually got a HAMP modification? Okay, so one of the pieces of foreclosure fallout with the HAMP program is a lot of people ended up having a really Kafka-esque type experience with their bank. And there's a prevalent attitude in this country which goes something like, I tried to work it out, the bank didn't cooperate, so screw the bank. Raise your hand if you've heard that. Okay, another cultural issue. HAFA has not seen too much. I mean, HARP is the refinance program, hasn't been as successful as it could have been either, because in the hardest hit states there's that 125% maximum cap on refinancing, and in places like Florida we're so far underwater that 125% just isn't going to cut it. But the bottom line is, I think that with HAMP and HAFA, the country discovered what our realtors knew all along, which was you can't make a home be affordable. If it's not affordable, lowering the interest rate just ain't going to cut it, because you still have taxes and insurance and utilities and all of those other things. I myself happen to be a HAFA girl. Is everyone familiar with HAFA? The Home Affordable Foreclosure Alternative? Raise your hand if you know about the Home Affordable Foreclosure Alternative. That's the one that covers short sales and deeds in lieu, and that's the one that's most relevant to the realtors that we're here to help. And of course, last month, and Stephen's going to get into more detail with this, we came out with some new guidelines on short sales. Raise your hand if your realtors have had trouble getting short sales done. Yeah, everyone. Okay. That's going to be changing. It may take a couple months, but this year that's the big thing. So if there's one takeaway that you can go back to them with is gear up for those short sales being able to go through, because it will happen. The new initiatives on June 1st require the banks to pay the full commission. Now, how great is that? They can't negotiate with realtors anymore on the commission. They establish a procedure for setting the price up front, and they establish timelines for getting back. It's 45 days for a final decision, 10 days to acknowledge the request, and every 15 days you have to notify the homeowner and the realtor if you can't get it done. They also deal with the deficiencies, which we've been talking about. Deficiencies are also going to be a big deal for realtors, and something that realtors need to be aware of. I've talked to a couple people here. How many people live in a recourse state? How many people live in a non-recourse state? How many people don't know? This is something you need to know, because we're going to see more and more lawsuits against realtors coming out of these short sales for selling homes and not telling the homeowner that there may be a deficiency, because we've got liability policies, and that's what they want to go after. How many people live in a trustee state? How about a judiciary state? How about you don't know? It's another piece of information. Just Google it and find out which is your state, because as these foreclosure bottlenecks kind of free up, there's going to be a lot more implication for the judiciary states. In any case, a lot of these obstacles for short sales will be removed. Under Making Home Affordable, just to mention, there's the 2MP program. There's also the PRA, which is a principal reduction program, and I'm kind of going through these quickly because we'll get in more detail afterwards. Show of hands, how many people think principal write-downs are a good idea? Okay, I personally agree. I'd love to be convinced otherwise, because I think we will be seeing them this year, which is another takeaway you can bring to realtors, but I agree. And then the last piece has been the UP forbearance program. We're going to be seeing a lot more programs this year to help with unemployment at the hardest hit fund, state level, at all kinds of levels. So that's something else that your realtors will be seeing. The next bucket of triage really fell under using the GSEs, and I think we're all familiar with these. The GSEs, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, were themselves involved in a lot of foreclosure intervention initiatives. They've also been involved in trying to keep credit flowing. They've been involved in the right to rent, and this is something else that realtors need to be aware of this year. We're going to be seeing a lot more fall under the right to rent. Fannie Mae's program is Lease for Deed. How many of you know about the Lease for Deed program? Okay, that allows a homeowner who's in default to actually give a deed in lieu of foreclosure for the home and then live there and rent it. And realtors need to be prepared for a lot more programs like that, because you're hearing a lot of speech from Washington peppered with affordable rental. So it may not just be a homeowner staying in their home, but it may be initiatives for affordable rentals. So those realtors who haven't liked doing rentals, because no one wanted to do those back when everyone was buying, maybe need to consider looking into that as a possibility, because it's going to be a good revenue generator. Same thing with Fannie Mae Home Path. Fannie Mae has done a lot in terms of helping to control inventory. This year, another 700,000 in units are expected to be taken back by inventory. We're going to be seeing a lot in terms of inventory control. After the Depression, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which was Roosevelt's program, was the biggest landlord. So realtors who can get involved with those government entities that are starting these rental programs will also do well, just like those realtors who had the forethought to get involved with the lenders with their REO programs are really, really busy listing properties. Another takeaway. Clearly, more needs to be done with inventory. There's a lot of rumblings about programs that allow investors to actually buy up more of this, because you know HomePath, a lot of these programs are really they're geared towards owners. There will be more investor programs as long as the investors commit to renting the properties afterwards. So there's some opportunity for realtors there. And then, of course, the last thing that the GSEs have been involved in is helping to establish protocols. Now, this is not along the lines of legislation, but it's worth mentioning. The court systems have also been involved in triage because they've been inundated. Who here is from New York or New Jersey? A couple people. New York, New Jersey, Florida. It's taking 3 years to finish a foreclosure. 3 years, often of a homeowner not making payments and not maintaining the property. And you tell me what that does to the values in that area when that property that hasn't been maintained for 3 years finally hits the market. In Florida, we experiment a little bit with the rocket docket. Did anyone hear about the rocket docket? I can tell who reads Rolling Stone magazine because there was a big article. Not many people. Anyway, it was retired judges who were hired to really get the cases through, got a lot of bad press. We don't have to worry about it anymore because guess what? Florida ran out of money, so there's no more rocket docket. The other program that's really worthwhile, and about half the states have this, is mandatory foreclosure mediation. Has anyone heard of the mandatory foreclosure mediation? Okay. And this is designed to help solve some of the problems up front. Essentially, the lenders need to go through the mediation program before they can move forward with their foreclosure case. This is a really good opportunity for your realtors because, number one, it gives them a chance to get to the table. They can be there if they're trying to negotiate a short sale. They get to go with the seller if they want and sit at the table with the bank and try to negotiate. But number two, and I forget who I was talking about this yesterday with, maybe Dana, were we talking about this? It's a great opportunity for realtors to become certified mediators because realtors are the key to solving this problem, and there is no one who can mediate a foreclosure problem better than a realtor. So if you live in one of those states, that's definitely some information that needs to get out there. They can be certified and generate some extra income doing that. Has anyone had a personal experience with a foreclosure mediation? No. We definitely, people in our organizations need to get more involved. The last one is, of course, the community preservation initiatives, which I think we're all familiar with. I've been talking to some people. Actually, the National Association of Realtors has gotten very involved with community preservation. I had lunch last week with someone from the Urban League, and she said, in Florida, we've had a lot of success. In other areas, it has not been as successful. The bottom line for community preservation, though, is I think as budgetary issues become more and more significant, this is probably going to be one of the areas that's money is not renewed. The triage challenges that we've had that continue are, number one, how do we distinguish the good guys who really need help and who we can actually help with these systems from the people who are just past the point of no return and from the bad guys who may be trying to milk this system a little. And then the unintended consequences. I mean, if your car broke down on the highway and your family was in it, you'd make sure you got your family to safety on the side of the road before you started changing the tire. Unfortunately, what we've been doing here is we're trying to triage the foreclosure problem, and at the same time, we're bringing out all these reforms and trying to punish the bad guys, and it's actually making the triage a lot more difficult to do. If we were to look at indicators, we can see that the triage so far has not been hugely successful. Does anyone see anything wrong with this graph? Does anyone really think foreclosures should be going down? No. I mean, this is like an indicator on roofies, because all it is unconscious right now, while the robo-signer issue holds it up. We know that that's not telling us the truth. Obviously, we know sales are down. We've seen a couple of little upticks, but for the most part down, and prices, of course, also down. We've seen some upticks. So if you had to guess, the indicators aren't working fabulously. At best, they're keeping things from getting worse. The last piece of the foreclosure initiatives from the fallout comes in the form of reform. This is trying to fix the systemic problems and punish the bad guys. And if you notice the categories, they mirror exactly the people who are sort of blamed for the crisis to begin with. So we've got our frontline industries, and for the most part, those are the robo-signer type issues where they're going after servicers. Everyone familiar with robo-signer here? Anyone not familiar with robo-signer? For us, it's been a big deal because it's all happening right in South Florida, and our kids are actually in school with some of the robo-signer, the well-known lawyers, their kids, and the AGs are people that we knew, so it's right in our backyard, and that's a whole other conversation. But robo-signer, we're looking at initiatives like SAFE, which was under discussion for a long time. Is everyone familiar with the SAFE program? Yeah, that's regulating basically mortgage brokers by state. We're looking at initiatives, of course, we talked a little bit yesterday about the GSEs, spent a long time talking about that, and those are things that are going to be coming into effect over the next couple of years, what they're involved in, what their mission is, that kind of thing. So far, though, you have to say that the biggest piece of reform in terms of foreclosure fallout, the biggest influence that reform has had has been just the uncertainty. That's the biggest impact that we've seen from these reform initiatives. Under the regulators, obviously, most of this is falling under Dodd-Frank. Everyone knows Dodd-Frank. And I have about 1 minute left before these guys have to talk, so we're not going to get into the 17 separate titles under Dodd-Frank. But in terms of the progress, we can say this was the 1-year anniversary of Dodd-Frank, so happy birthday, Dodd-Frank. Of the 28 financial overhaul rulemaking deadlines, 28 of them have been missed. Of the 385 new rules to be written, they've completed only 24, and 41 of those such actions should have been taken by now. So obviously, we're not up to speed. Everyone's aware of what's going on with the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau and our new sort of alleged appointee. We'll see what happens with that. But obviously, a lot of the decision-making under these reforms is going to have to go through them. As it is, they have until 2013 to finalize that, and most of it doesn't go into effect until 12 months later. So the takeaway for realtors is, bottom line, as far as reform goes, it's going to be a while before we actually see the impacts of any real reform in these systems. And in the meantime, we're all going to be just beaten to death with the uncertainty that having that hang over our heads has. The other thing that I think is very important, just from a theoretical conversation, is that we are now indoctrinating. When I first started talking, we were talking about foreclosure becoming part of our culture. We're indoctrinating procedures that will address foreclosures and servicing and all of those things. So foreclosure truly has become part of our culture and an institution. Last thing just worth mentioning is all the lawsuits, because I personally think that this is going to have a much bigger impact on the industry and on banks than any sort of reform that may or may not happen and that they think they're going to control anyway. So 5 of the largest banks and servicers face up to $30 billion in robo-signer gate issues. My personal opinion is that's going to do a lot more to get these folks to change the way they do things than some rule in Washington that they think they can outmaneuver anyway. 67 class action suits, another 102 suits, plus the bad press, plus your bank stock going down. That's going to get them to make a difference. And then the last thing I just wanted to mention in terms of what realtors can expect. Did anyone follow the president's Twitter town hall? Yeah. Okay, well, one of the things he said is they're going back to the drawing board, which is probably a good idea because they've learned what realtors have known all along, to make further adjustments, modify loans more quickly. Now, do we think that's going to happen? I don't know if it's possible anymore, but also see if there's circumstances where we may be reducing principal. And given the size of the housing market, no federal program is going to be able to solve the problem. Some folks bought more home than they could afford, and probably they're better off renting. So again, one of the takeaways we need to let our realtors know is that rentals may be a good end of the business to get into. I thank you for listening. I'm sorry I had to breeze through that so quickly, but we're going to be getting into some more detail with these. So hopefully you'll have some good questions.